AML Insights, the importance and implementation of governance.
Hello everybody and welcome to this session on AML. I hope you are having a very productive few days in Kenya. I'm sitting here with two, probably one of the most global experts that I certainly know on the area of AML and CFT. So we have here Owen Baldacchino. That's right, isn't it?
Correct.
And John Caruana. So Owen and John, do you want to make a quick introduction to yourselves?
Thank you for having me over here, and hello to everyone. My name is Owen. I've been involved with the gambling industry since around 2014. In my experience, I did several different roles, whether to do with consultancy, audit, key role, and eventually I joined the industry. And nowadays I'm a deputy MLRO for William Hill International.
And John?
Hello everyone, thank you for having me here. My pleasure. I'm John Caruana. I am a partner at Radix Group here in Malta. We specialize in AML consultancy and GDPR consultancy as well. I've been involved in AML for 10 plus years. I am also an MLRO in the gaming industry, B2C. Well, my everyday job is basically related to AML and helping companies deal with AML issues, regulatory issues, and other related issues.
Okay, so if we just jump straight in, then I mean, we're sitting here in Malta. We are as a jurisdiction and as being part of the EU and subject to FATF and FATCA regulations, we are very, very highly regulated. And there are benefits, there's onerous, responsibilities to that on companies. But here in Africa, there aren't the same level of AML regulations. So if we start with the question of, why is that important and why can that make a difference? Given that, like you said, John, and yourself as well, Owen, you spend your day living and breathing AML, and it's not the same, it doesn't have the same kind of emphasis over here in the continent of Africa.
Well, I think when Malta introduced regulation, okay, and not just gaming, but other types of regulation, financial services, there will always be a level of over-regulation at one point, and then there will be deregulation and re-regulation. So it's a process. We are learning and we're finding that balance. Obviously, having no regulation at all puts you at a disadvantage when dealing with, especially potential of dealing with criminal activity and damaging your reputation, both as a firm at micro level and both at macro level, at a country, or both even as a continent. But if you find the right balance in the regulation, then you can attract genuine people, genuine players to you that are clean, that enhance your reputation and enhance your business as well.
Okay, Owen, do you want to add on to that?
Yes, I completely agree with John. I do remember the days when gaming operators in Malta were not subject persons to the EU regulation on anti-money laundering.
Just for the audience, can I interrupt? Yeah. When you say subject persons, just because we're speaking, that's yes, quite a niche definition. Do you want to explain that, please?
Okay, when we talk about a subject person in simplified terms, it is an entity, an organization which would fall under that regulation. All right, that is a very oversimplistic definition of it. So gaming operators became subject persons to the EU AML directive starting from 2018. And I remember the first questionnaires that we had to file for the FIU. Before that, AML was maybe simply related to collecting an ID or a proof of address, but that's it. But it does go much more than that in terms of a regulation and also what type of thresholds. At the end of the day, AML is important to build a reputable business. And when you have an economy that's expanding, like the likes of Africa looking at expansion of economies, right? And this is why it is important not only to expand the economy, but to expand it in a way that your reputation is sound and it is sustainable going forward.
I want to come on to sustainability in a moment, because there is kind of a, you want to manage growth so you don't kind of outpace yourself. We'll come on to that in a moment. But what you were saying there about, about the individual African countries, and especially you take the gaming jurisdictions. If one gaming jurisdiction, puts a kind of a stick in the sand and says, right, here's the AML jurisdiction, regulations. It's going to make it onerous on the players. It's going to make it onerous on the operators. That puts that jurisdiction instantly at a disadvantage in the short term, certainly. So, where is the incentive to actually set very solid, reasonable AML guidelines? Is it something that everybody should chat together about? Is it the...
You mentioned the word reasonable, but in AML we are talking about a risk-based approach.
Okay.
I'm quite sure that not every country in Africa, the players coming from every country, would pose the same level of risk.
Same as anywhere in Europe or the world or anywhere.
How do you design an effective AML CFT program? You have to understand your risk. This is always what we are trained as well in this jurisdiction, to understand the level of risk that is being posed in that gaming jurisdiction, under that gaming license in this case. For instance, with the Malta Gaming Authority license, you can operate in multiple countries. But if you're talking about a country specific, like Sweden, then you have a different level of risk. It's not to say that it's less or higher, but it's just different, because your customers are different, your geographies are different, your payment methods are even different, and the way you identify players.
So with that, I mean, when you're starting from a situation where their AML isn't kind of closely guarded, it isn't highly regulated, would a prescriptive approach be a better way to start? Because that puts everybody, I say every country, every jurisdiction on the same level, rather than starting with a risk-based. That because risk-based approach is very not insular, but is very inward looking, and that's where people can they make their own decisions. You suffer the consequences, good or bad. But if it's prescriptive, would that not allow a continent such as Africa, from a gaming perspective, have a start, get a foothold, and then countries and jurisdictions and regulators can evolve themselves? What do you think of that? I've just thought of it now, so
I think
it might be crazy.
There will be part of the regulation which applies to everyone, which is even in Europe, that's the case. Yeah. For example, if you're dealing with a politically exposed person, then they will tell you it's always going to be a high-risk classification. That's one thing. Related to certain sanctions, the same thing. What we're saying here is that the risk-based approach would give you a little bit of more flexibility, because you have very limited resources, and you don't want to use those resources across the boards, because you might get lost in translation. So if you have 10,000 clients and you're applying the same due diligence across 10,000 clients, it wouldn't be very beneficial for you. While if you're applying a risk-based approach, maybe only 1,000 of those 10,000 clients are high risk, the majority are medium, and some are low. And so you're applying a different effort according to the risk. So the higher the risk, the more time, the more money I'm spending as a company on that particular client. The lower the risk, the less time I'm dedicating when it comes to AML to that client. And so when you look at averaging your exposure, it is usually in your benefit to apply a risk-based approach rather than previously, like in the third AML directive, we used to apply a blanket approach,
No, but see, the reason I say that is because, somebody has to start. If it's not prescriptive, somebody has to start. And a regulation that does start, like I was saying, does put its operators at a disadvantage because it's asking more of the players. So I'm just wondering, and it does take a very strong, brave, regulation to say, right, we may take a hit in the short term, but let's look at the longer term.
If we talk about Africa specific, there is the SAMLG, which is the South Africa and Eastern Africa AML group that is focusing on doing mutual evaluations per country. And those evaluations are based off the FATF recommendations, okay?
So those 40 recommendations.
Exactly. This group is doing evaluations, and most recently they've done the Kenyan evaluation as well, and they came up with their findings and recommendations. So that would be a great place to start if I were to make some recommendations here. On the other hand, there can also be lessons learned from other jurisdictions.
Yes.
So if we talk about Malta, the effectiveness of our AML program was assessed with the Manival Committee, and then we had the, unfortunately led to grey listing. But then there was a lot of work done to rectify that, and we came out of it.
And one thing I think is interesting from that, Malta went in as a country and came out within a 12-month kind of period, came out at a very fast pace. What I found was very interesting in that was a lot of people, when the country went into the grey list, they were saying, well, it's gaming, isn't it? And gaming actually wasn't.
No,
gaming actually came out.
Yes, most of the tax was related to tax.
Gaming was actually not necessarily commended, but was flagged as kind of having a good approach.
Specifically, the Manival report did state that.
Yeah. So I think that's very interesting because so many, in our industry we get so many detractors, don't we? Everybody just, immediately if there's something wrong, well, it's got to be gaming. There's, but I did find that interesting. After we came out on the same session, Gibraltar went into the grey list for its AML. Do you want to kind of add to that? Is it for the same reasons? I think gaming was more heavily cited there as being the reason.
No, but they had other issues like the transparency with the beneficial ownership information, which, to our surprise, we had that EU court ruling most recently, and kind of felt a bit as a blow to the AML community in general. But what we are saying is that gaming wasn't the only focus area which needed improvement. The country in general needed to improve its AML, CFT supervision.
Okay, and so if we're talking about, I want to get on to Curacao as well in a moment, because Curacao, let's talk about that now. So Curacao is one of the most long-standing jurisdictions in the world. It has been widely known for its relaxed stance on AML requirements and AML standards. And the Minister of Finance, well, they're changing the regulations now, and the Minister of Finance in Curacao has been quite open about the fact that there has been dirty money flowing through that country, flowing through the system, and they are now looking to eviscerate that and change that. If one of the oldest jurisdictions, and yes, they are looking at this from being a part of the Dutch Commonwealth, but if one of the oldest jurisdictions is kind of saying, okay, we're shaking it up here, AML is a critical part for our country's reputation, even for payment processing, payment processors and payment gateways, you have to have AML standards within the regulations in order for them to even be able to take your business so as not to put themselves in default in their own regulations.
So you can have a situation where you have an indirect exposure, not just direct exposure. So you can say, okay, as a country, I don't want to introduce this regulation. But then your companies that are linked, maybe they have banking relationships outside of your country, their banks would say, since your reputation has gone down because you don't have the regulation, then we don't want to continue banking with you. And their payment service providers would do the same. And then their suppliers would do the same. So having regulation in place, or rather not having regulation in place, sometimes can have repercussions on the businesses, and it can turn the economy into a closed economy.
And this actually relates as well. I mean, we've previously discussed on how doing business in a country that doesn't have strong AML regulations put you in breach, for example, in the US. On a sanctions basis.
Yes, the selection of the jurisdiction of the gaming operator is very much important, because when you are in a position when your business is expanding and you want to go into more jurisdictions, and online gaming has gone through all these series of changes of regulation, especially since COVID times, right? When the US states started to regulate more. And obviously they discovered that there was a very much of a positive effect on the economy of each state when getting the taxes from online gaming
money,
versus
everything changes,
exactly. And you had other jurisdictions that regulated, most recently in 2022, Ontario. What am I saying is that if you used to, as an operator, used to use a license to go into operate into another jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction has launched the licensing regime, and you want to still be present, you have to conform to the new rules. Now, there is going to be a larger gap than operating out in the Wild West, so to speak, than already having a baseline of policies, procedures, and controls, and then you adapt to the policies and procedures and controls that are needed to operate in that jurisdiction. Case in point, you had operators with an MGA license who perhaps found a less gap to obtain an Ontario license, because very much the intent is similar. There's the responsible gaming part, there is the AML part, which is very strong. You have some considerations to do with thresholds, at what point you ask for customer verification. But again, it's just merely moving the process forward when you are acquiring your customer, rather than not having it at all and doing all that development of the policies and procedures and your controls. So there the gap was much smaller, and this is why it is another reason to start now, if you don't have anything, to have a baseline, so that if regulation changes are in place, or you want to expand into other jurisdictions, then you already have a baseline on which to work.
Yeah, because for me that's an interesting thing, because a lot of the in the main gambling markets, the dominant gambling markets in Africa, there are key players. There are strong dominant players. There isn't necessarily the same number and volume of operators that exists in other territories, and I'm saying territories very broadly, like the US, like LATAM, like Europe. But now we're seeing these larger global players like 888, for instance, have recently entered the market, and this is where AML, I think, becomes more critical, because for outside and global players who have multi-jurisdictional licenses, to have these, to build markets in Africa, and to build markets themselves, and also for the economies to grow and the jurisdictions to grow, AML has to naturally become a fit, or else it can never really grow beyond a local company. And that might be fine, but if you're looking for international, global kind of a global a global presence, then that's where AML has to be, it's a no-brainer. It's a yes or no situation.
Because at the end of the day, we're looking at risk management. So without AML, you mentioned Curaçao, for example. I'm consulting companies in Curaçao because of the change in the movement towards being fully regulated. The issue here is there are instances where companies got no idea about the risks that they are running. And that is a problem for the company itself. If I don't know the risks that I'm running, then the chance that something can happen and I end up being pulled down with a client because for some reason I've been linked to a crime as a company, that ruins all the investment I've done for the past years. So it's very important. We tend to see AML as a restriction that's pulling us down or slowing us from growing faster, but in reality, it keeps you in check. You mentioned sanctions. Again, it keeps you, since it gives you certain obligations, it makes you check sanctions. Because you mentioned US sanctions, you can be in a situation where you are exposed to a US sanction, even though you are dealing with a player in Africa.
Yeah.
Okay, so and that can compromise your company. It can destroy your company. The repercussion of that. So I think having such regulation in place in the long term, especially, gives you more control about the risks that you want to take and the risk that you're taking. As long as you know the risk that you're taking, then you can mitigate against those risks and decide whether to run that risk or not, or leave it behind. Yeah. But it's your decision at the end.
Just to continue what John is saying. So fundamentally, we're talking about risk exposure and risk appetite. If we're talking about a large operator with multi-jurisdictional licenses, the reporting that goes into the other jurisdictions is to the likes of, have you had any enforcement action from any other gaming jurisdiction? Yeah. So it is within their interest to harmonize their approach to AML. Maybe not make it identical, but harmonize. But I believe these large operators do have a very important role in setting the tone, if you like, at what the approach or the ideal approach should be. Okay, so I feel that there is that contribution that operators with multiple jurisdiction licenses can offer. At the same time, you obviously can't discount the opportunities that lie with the medium and the smaller operators or the startups. But again, as well, the risks that they pose. So ideally, you don't end up with many small operators that are just running offshore on the regulations and doing as they please. But then you have the larger organizations that are setting the tone. And then you'd have the regulator just enforcing the larger operators. Yeah. Okay, so I think that has to be also put into effect. It goes as well into what we're saying about the risk-based approach, that there is no one size fits all. Okay, it depends on the product you're offering, on the payment methods, on the customers. Okay, so you can't really put everyone the same. Even when doing enforcement, you can't really do the same level of supervision.
So we're running out of time now, so I just want to ask kind of, we're probably gone over time, but I just want to ask one kind of more question, which is, for the audience here, in terms of AML, what would, and it's made up of kind of regulators, operators, B2C, B2B, the entire gamut. So, what would your advice be as into, if you were to take a next step to protect yourself and your player and the country and economy? How would you go about it?
So talking about it is the first step.
Okay.
Like we are gathering here, we are sharing opinions, but there's also professional groups or communities can be created of professionals. Compliance officers obviously have a very central point in explaining to business owners, look, this is what you need to do, and these are the effects of not doing anything. Of course, doing nothing is an option as well when you are managing your risk. But eventually, it will come at a cost, as we've seen in other jurisdictions. So definitely talk more. Having these kind of discussions is important to setting the pace for improvement, and also looking at what's happening globally. I like to joke with my colleagues that it's not just about Malta, that we are here and working here, but we do live in a global economy. Our industry is present all over the world. Okay, more and more jurisdictions regulated. There's a lot of compliance work to do, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned as well. Some jurisdictions do things one way, so other jurisdictions do it another way, and there's always stuff to learn like that.
Yeah, well, there's not much more to add to that. I think discussing with authorities the benefits of having regulation and what we call lobbying. At the end of the day, you need to convince, you need to use the politics of persuasion, that you make people see that this is for the benefit of the country, of the economy. You're creating jobs in the long term. You're creating compliance officer jobs, risk officers jobs, directorships. You're adding a new income stream as well in the country with foreign direct investment. So this goes beyond regulation. Regulation is more the key, but you have a long road ahead after you start introducing regulation. So by introducing the regulation, at least as a basic form, you're giving that message to the world that we're serious, we're trying to invest in our country, we're trying to attract certain level of investors here, certain level of standard, and you're creating that standard. As Owen said, learning from other countries, maybe getting experts like Malta did in the financial services. We've got experts from the UK come to Malta, we learned from them, and now we're in a position to help other jurisdictions. So it's a long-term process, but I am sure that in 20, 30 years' time, if jurisdictions in Africa, they would look back and they take the action now, I think it would be a success story.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so you're not, this is pre-recorded, so your bios and your details are all available on the website. So this is Owen Baldacchino and John Caruana. Thank you very much.